Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Dutch Perm Rep and welcome to this event on political content online, the future of political advertising and fact-checking. My name is Robert de Groot. I'm the Dutch permanent representative. I've just come from the European Parliament, where there was an event on the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, a very impressive event in which a 91-year-old Italian senator spoke, who spent too many years to march back to Germany, and I think she made a very important point. And the point she made, which I would like to say, was that nothing is more worthwhile and more important than knowledge or knowing about the past. And when I walked back from the European Parliament to this event, I saw many parallels between what we are going to discuss here this afternoon and the message from generations before us on what is really important about our values here in the European Union and our democratic values, our human rights, that is very important to know. And that, of course, also feeds into the subject we are discussing today. And I think democratic elections, well, already those two words are ready for a complete discussion for more than a day. Do elections exist without being democratic? Are they elections if they are not democratic? But they are the cornerstones of our society, and we've seen in recent years things have changed tremendously and will continue to change in the near future because the digital transformation of our societies is not fulfilled at all. I think we are on the brink of a new stage with artificial intelligence and the use and manipulation of data for which we don't complete time. It's of the utmost importance to uphold the freedom of speech and maintain an accessible and free internet. And this balance between freedom of accession to the internet and expression and gathering information, and on the other side responsibilities of what is on online platforms, who puts it on, is it true or is it not true? I think this very important balance we have not yet found. So the question remains more of the how than of the what. So in this context, the two topics relevant are the political advertising and, of course, fact-checking. And this afternoon we will start with political advertising. Naturally, the rules on political advertising are fundamental for ensuring fair elections. We in the Netherlands are currently reviewing our national legislation on this issue, but with so many different actors involved, ranging from political parties domestically, European political parties, to online platforms and citizens, who should now conclude by going back to what we are remembering today and earlier this week in Auschwitz, that I think if we do not focus on knowledge, I think there's not much use in remembering. And I would like to thank you all for attending and wish you a very fruitful afternoon. Thank you.
May I now invite the speakers of our first panel to go and take their place here on the platform. So you can stand here on the
Thank you all, and it's really great to be here. I'd firstly just like to thank the Ministry of the Interior and Kingdom Relations for inviting us to speak about legislation on online political advertising. I'd also like to thank the officials from the Permanent Representative of the Netherlands here. It looks like a really great day. So what I was going to do was briefly talk about the findings of a report that I co-authored with some colleagues from the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam. Now, the report was for the Ministry of the Interior, and we basically looked at how the issue of political advertising is regulated from a legal perspective. And helpfully, we also conducted a number of country studies on different kinds of laws that have been enacted already. Now, our interim report was sent to the Dutch Parliament in October 2019, and our final report will be submitted to the Dutch Parliament in March. It'll also be available in both Dutch and English. So for today, I'm not going to talk about all the issues that we addressed in our report, such as this issue of disinformation or EU codes of practice or GDPR enforcement. Instead, we thought it would be helpful to focus. So the first issue I wanted to talk about is freedom of expression. And one of the main questions that people ask is online political advertising covered by the right to freedom of expression? And if it is, how much protection does it enjoy from government regulation? Now, this is important because any legislation would need to be consistent with this fundamental right. Well, freedom of expression is covered by the EU Charter. Voters is an exercise of political expression, and this is so irrespective of the fact that it's presented as a paid advertisement. And not only that, but another question that's asked is just what exactly is political advertising? Is it just ads by political parties, or does it also include so-called issue ads? Well, helpfully, the court actually takes quite a broad view of what political advertising is. Crucially, the court has held that political advertising not only includes political ads by political parties, but also includes political ads from NGOs and campaign groups on matters of broader public interest. Now, there is an important consequence of paid political advertising being considered political speech, and that is that the court applies. Norwegian political party argued that Norway's ban on political advertising violated its right to freedom of expression in the run-up to Norwegian elections. Now, the court recognized there could be reasons for regulating political expression or political advertising, such as preventing the financially powerful from obtaining an undesirable advantage in public debates, or ensuring a level playing field in the field of elections. But the court said that these general objectives of the ban could not justify its application to this political party at issue, which was a small pensioners' party. The court unanimously held that the ban violated Article 10. So given this, the privileged position of political speech under Article 10, it seems that legislation restricting online political advertising might be a little bit difficult. But the issue is not clear-cut, as there is some uncertainty in the case law. And this is because the court held in another case called Animal Defenders International versus the United Kingdom that a ban on paid political ads in the United Kingdom on television did not violate Article 10. But unlike TV Vest, the case concerned a campaign group which sought to broadcast a political ad outside of an election period. Now, while I won't carried a risk of abuse by wealthy groups being fronted by other advocacy groups. So after Animal Defenders, it's not quite clear how the court would consider legislation restricting online political advertising, but it is important to note that the court was terribly divided in a 9-8 vote, and the court did not expressly overrule TV Vest. But it does. Advertising is regulated in 7 countries. I won't go into all the findings we have for each of those countries today, but instead I just want to mention some to come up individually. Now, one of the countries I want to quickly mention was France. In contrast to all other countries, France regulates election time political advertising in newspapers, broadcasting, and online. Importantly, under 2 sections of the Electoral Code, during the 6 months prior to an election, the use for the purpose of so-called election propaganda of any commercial advertising in the press, audiovisual media, and even online is prohibited. Now, importantly, in 2018, France introduced even more rules under its law on the manipulation of information, where certain platforms must provide users with fair, clear, and transparent information about who paid for promoted content on matters of general interest. And platforms must also provide fair, clear, and transparent information about personal data that's been used in the targeting of those advertisements. And also, platforms must create a publicly accessible register of this promoted content. So during election time, paid content on general interest debates are subject to transparency and ad library type rules. Now, I want to mention what happened in France after it introduced these rules in December 2018. And this was before platforms such as Twitter introduced global bans on certain political ads. Following the law's passage, Twitter and Microsoft both banned all political campaigning and issue advocacy ads in France, and Google banned all ads on promoted content related to a debate of general interest during the French elections, including on YouTube. Now, it's not just France that has legislated targeting online political advertising. Canada has also enacted interesting legislation under its Election Modernisation Act 2018. It provides that platforms that sell advertising space to political parties, candidates, and groups must publish a registry of all election advertising published on the platform during the election period. Canada went even further and banned the selling of certain political advertising by platforms to foreign parties, groups, and governments. And similar to France, platforms like Google decided that certain political ads would not be allowed during the 2019 Canadian elections. And the final country I just wanted to quickly mention was the United States. Now, a lot of people have heard about the Honest Ads Act. Well, it is just a bill, and it does include rules on transparency, on political ads, ad library obligations, and rules to ensure no ads from foreign nationals. However, what is important to know is that a number of states have already enacted legislation on online political advertising, such as California's Social Media Disclose Act, which requires platforms to include a disclosure on who paid for certain political ads and requires platforms to set up an ad library. While New York, Maryland, and a number of other states, including Washington State, have enacted similar rules that target platforms in relation to online political advertising. And similarly, platforms such as Facebook have responded by not accepting certain political ads in Washington State, for instance. Now, these are just some of the laws that have been enacted, and it's more extensive in our report. But the final point I wanted to talk about were some of the findings that we made. Now, I don't have time to go through them all, but an important finding is that most of the legislation mainly concerns amendments to election legislation. And most of the rules which can be imposed on the person or party buying the ad or can be imposed on the platforms themselves. Then second, there are transparency rules focusing on the personal data used in the targeting of advertisements. Third, there are transparency rules focusing on political ad archive obligations placed on platforms. And we also found that campaign finance laws are an important instrument where there are obligations to report on spending on online political advertising and generally on online campaigning. There are also rules prohibiting foreign spending on election time political advertising. And finally, there are prohibitions on paid political advertising during election time. So these are just some of the findings from our report, which we discussed in much more detail. I hope this short overview was interesting and helpful for today's discussion. And the report will be sent to the Dutch Parliament on the 26th of March. And so I just want to finish there. Thanks for listening, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that brief presentation, Ronan. I'll be taking over from here on in. My name is Samuel Stolten. I'm the digital editor of Euractiv. We're going to be having a short panel discussion now on the subject of political advertising online for about 20 minutes or so, after which we'll open up the freeze here at the Dutch Permanent Representation, so feel free to get as involved as you would like in the debate. After this panel, we will be moving on to a presentation from Shannon Baker from the fact-checking platform new.nl, and then we'll be having another panel discussion on the subject of online fact-checking. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel for this session. We have Harry Panagopoulos from DG Just at the European Commission. We have Meg Chang, public Ronan's presentation.
For a very interesting and sort of rich presentation, which kind of neatly helps me launch what I want to talk about. Because in a sense, it's certainly your findings point to the approach that we've been taking from the Commission side throughout the process of our work on democracy, in the sense that we've been looking at, obviously, with an eye on our response to disinformation and interference in elections, we've been looking at this subject very broadly. Just to quickly sort of enumerate the challenges, we face rise of populism, attacks targeting our elections and our democratic institutions. We have an erosion of public confidence in our processes, which make us more vulnerable. Ambitious new push, September 2018. It included political election cooperation networks, online transparency of political ads and communications, appropriate sanctions for the use of personal data to influence elections, protection against cybersecurity incidents, awareness-raising activities, and manipulation of elections by disinformation campaigns, promoting rule of law, fundamental rights, in particular freedom of expression and association, rights to privacy, and to procedural safeguards. We were doing this consciously in a context where member states have great competence, and there are many rules governing many aspects of our electoral policy. And they can vary from member state to member state. They include variations on who is responsible for monitoring on best practices and learnings through the elections. As I said, we'll be issuing our report on that soon. I can already say that, you know, we've we've managed to establish a level of cooperation that has never been seen before in European elections. In particular, we've working with other institutions. I see some of them here, right up near the front, by the platforms themselves. But there was also direct engagement with the member states. They tell us that it needs to be done more equally. There's certainly room for improvement, room for development, and that the coordination with state authorities in running elections and sort of adapting to national rules could be better. The other thing that we learn, of course, and shouldn't come as a surprise to people here, is that transparency is absolutely essential. Transparency is essential to democracy in general as a principle, but in these circumstances, transparency of where money comes from, of who's providing advertising, is crucial. Political parties, as well as member states, were invited to sort of promote transparency and to take steps to make sure that people were informed and to be adequately sensitized to the issues of disinformation and to the issues that were affecting our elections. And just to sort of wrap it up, this is what we will be feeding into our action plan on a European Democracy Action Plan, which...
Hi, thank you for inviting me to this event. We definitely find it very important for us to be participating in these kind of discussions because we learn a lot from it, and basically what we get out of these, or not every election, but I follow elections across EMEA and basically coordinate all the integrity efforts that we do for every election. So all the work that we do around. So with regard to political advertising, and Ronan, your presentation was brilliant because there was a lot, you hit on a lot of key points and challenges that we experienced as we were coming up with how do we deal with political advertising. In general, how do we come up with the policies and the tools that we need to make advertisers more accountable for what they're engaged in political discourse and using advertising to promote their messages. So for example, going beyond political parties and so these are the challenges that we're dealing with. And then not to add to that, definitions. What is political advertising? What is issues advertising? So as we're developing our policies and tools, and and it's a work in progress where we continue to develop our tools and policies based on the learnings that we take from every election, these are all the different challenges that we're trying to, or questions that we're trying to answer as we're doing this. So this is how we ended up with what you're seeing now, the ads transparency tools that here in the EU we rolled out last March, prior to the European election. So as part of that, a very big part of what we're doing around political advertising is really focusing on authenticity, transparency, and accountability. Authenticity is where we're trying to make sure that these advertisers are really who they say they are, that they're disclosing that who's really paying for these ads. So that's the authenticity component. The transparency component is where we're trying to then spotlight all these actors, who it is that's behind these ads, and basically the different ad details that we now store in the ad library. So the ad library API, and the ad library report is a really big part of it. And then when it comes to the accountability part, we've made all of these tools available to almost 200 countries now. And the ad library report and the API, as well as the ad library itself, as you can see for every election, like the European elections, the most recent UK elections, it is now used more and more by not only researchers, but journalists themselves. So I worked on the UK election just in December, and the amount of articles that were coming out on a daily basis about the UK general election and political advertisement was tremendous. And we felt, and this is where we see that transparency plays a very key role around the political advertisements when it comes to election time. But again, what happens outside of the election time? What are people doing with all of this information outside elections and ads? And what regulation are there? Should we continue to be regulated? Should we continue to apply these rules during non-election time? Because we get asked these questions a lot by parties and candidates, like, why are you still enforcing on these political ads when the election's over? So, and when you look at that, when you look at like all of the different things that we're trying to do for elections, a lot of these activities occur even long before an election is called. So of course you want to then start looking at things even before election time, right? When you look at so-called threat actors or bad actors, they usually start their operation before an election is called. They kind of have an idea, and it's like maybe months before or years before an election is called that they're beginning their activity. So this is where, like, right now, regulation as we see it, there's a lot of gaps in regulation addressing these kind of challenges and threats because it's so focused on the electoral period. So that's one of the key things. So this is why, like, in terms of when we talk about political advertisements now, we are trying to work with government and regulators. We are trying to talk to people and basically advocate for regulation, better regulation, or smarter regulation to address all of these different areas that, in our experience, are major gaps and questions that need to be answered.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Meg. Much appreciated. Before bringing in Ronan again, actually, I'd like to turn to Harry now for just a question on responsibility. And you mentioned briefly when referring to the Democracy Action Plan, the possibility for future legislation. In your opinion, who should be targeted as part of any future legislative framework? I mean, are we talking about political parties? Are we talking about campaign organisations or market players such as the platforms themselves? Who do you see as responsible in this regard?
Well, one thing that I would like to say is that at the moment there are, there is legislation which applies to this context, things on the basis of a person's conduct on an online platform. That involves the processing of personal information, and that places upon the person doing the processing certain obligations, which include being transparent about who you are and why you are doing this this targeting. There are already responsibilities which people have to meet at a European level. There are other responsibilities, for instance, in terms of prohibited speech, hate speech, and incitements to violence, which have a European dimension as well as a national dimension. And then, of course, there are the national electoral rules which govern some of these things, and other rules to do with the media environment. So it's not to say that we're discussing this in a legal vacuum. This is a relatively rich legal environment in which there is a new activity where we are looking at where additional responsibilities might need to be introduced, and where I should say there are responsibilities for all the actors in this area already. The platforms have responsibilities, and political parties, advertisers, and advertisers who are unrelated to political parties. So it's a relatively.
Are these kind of measures going to be available in a European context as well?
Yeah, so when it comes to responsibility, we take it seriously, not just in the US, but globally. But we don't necessarily roll everything out globally at first, because we want to make sure the product is working as intended before we start doing a global launch here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I'd like to bring in Ronan again here. And when we're talking about the scope of a potential framework on political advertising,
About is it money in elections, or is it misuse of personal data, or is it this concept of disinformation? Because they're very different problems, and there are different mechanisms on how to remedy those. Across the political spectrum, it wasn't just on the left or on the right. So we need to think about the practices of political parties as well, because they're one of the main users of political advertisers, or of political advertising services on these platforms. And then the second point I wanted to make is we should maybe think about that if the European Union does decide to step in here on political advertising, it will be the first time it has done it. It didn't step in under the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. It didn't step in under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, and only on the recently reworded AVMSD. It also didn't, while it extended some rules to YouTube, it didn't extend anything to do with political advertising. So we need to really take account of the fact that this would be a big step for the European Union, and it needs to take account of the national rules that are quite diverse. And I think our report really brings that to the fore.
Mm-hmm. And again, of course,
Show some transparency between level of transparency. This regulation is due to be evaluated in 2021. It was applied for the first time in the European elections, and of course it will take some time for practices.
Directing a question towards one of our panelists, I would much appreciate it. We have one gentleman there and then a gentleman down the front.
Hello, everyone. Oh, this is very loud. Hi, my name is Greg Polad. I'm the Director General of the Association of Commercial Television in Europe. We've been privileged to work a lot on disinformation through the sounding board that was there to assess the code of practice on disinformation, which we regrettably found to be completely useless. I have questions, and I'm very happy that the ambassador brought up Holocaust Memorial Day. Maggie, you talked about the difference between issues and political advertising. Often the lines blur. And since we're on the topic of Holocaust Memorial Day, maybe you can enlighten us as to why is it that Holocaust denial on Facebook is still not viewed as an illegal content?
Meg, if you'd like to respond to that one.
Misinformation or hate speech, and trying to find the right definitions to allow us to police it in a way that is appropriate. That also doesn't infringe upon freedom of expression and freedom of speech. We should be making these decisions in terms of certain content and how we should be dealing with it.
Mm-hmm. I just want to be very clear, because this is an important issue. Is, for Facebook, Holocaust denial a matter of opinion? Yes or no?
It is a matter of expression, freedom of expression, and freedom of speech.
Then you are against the law in many, many member states in Europe. So just so you're aware of the situation.
Let's bring Ronan in here for the expert view on this point. I mean, freedom of expression, there must be limits to this at some point, shouldn't there?
Yeah, and the court has a number of cases on Holocaust denial, and unfortunately it isn't a black and white issue and regulation in all member states, but of course they are free to bring certain viewpoints to viewers and then challenge those. So it's not the case that we can't discuss these things in broadcasting. They are there, but they're challenged. Maybe online you don't get the challenge that broadcasters do so well.
Thank you. Meg, there does seem to be this resistance from Facebook to address these issues front on. I mean, can you...
External oversight board now as well, where we're looking to people outside of the company to tell us, advise us on the direction we should be taking. And if you look at where we started and where we are now, we have taken a very active role in terms of updating our policy, for example, manipulated media and videos and taking that down if it's falls within that category. We updated our voter suppression policies recently. We're constantly updating our policies, but it's not a quick process because we want to make sure that we're getting as many voices in these to help us make these decisions as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. We touched on another point there briefly just before we turn to another question down here on the Code of Practice Against Disinformation. Harry, generally, I mean, how do you assess the platform's performance as part of the Code of Practice on disinformation, and will those results go on and inform the Democracy Action Plan and the Digital Services Act and such forth?
Yeah, I'm going to have to dodge that one slightly, just in the sense that the Code of Practice is about to be assessed. I mean, we're about to issue our assessment on it. I mean, it's absolutely clear that it will be part of the new number of things that we're going to put in to inform the European Democracy Action Plan, including the report that we will do on the elections. And we've also sort of published a summary of the platform's own self-assessments, which you can view online. But I would say, give it a little time, and you'll know what our opinion is.
We've got some digging around to do. This gentleman down the front, please.
Hi, my name is Felix of the External Action Service, just across the street. We talked a little bit about the kind of tools we may have at our disposal, as well as the actors that should be targeted by regulation, rules and transparency requirements.
Great question. The scope of political ads. Meg?
Are you referencing like politician speech or political speech in general?
Whatever may be subject of regulation.
There is a point that needs to be made that if we start to regulate paid political advertising, it's going to push a lot of political campaigning to organic content and send what they're spending money on, including if you have a team of Twitter people who are pushing out content on social media, which a lot of political parties do. And we're able to capture that kind of paid political communication because it is paid political communication. So one way is campaign finance disclosures.
Okay. Meg?
So the way we look at it is our policies around political advertisements are actor agnostic. So it doesn't matter if you're a political party or a candidate or if you're a company or a private individual, advertising specifically.
So that wouldn't count as advertising
So if it's organic content, it would
If I buy followers, for instance, or likes or engagement to push organic content, I feel like it's a bit of a rhetorical difference or distinction between that and political ads. Because in both cases, you use money to push political content.
That I think are going to emerge as part of the Democracy Action Plan in the future. Harry, what's your take on it, on how you identify a political statement or a political actor who isn't a politician? I mean, how do we approach these types of questions?
Well, I think to be fair, we have been sort of more focused on looking at conduct that we find problematic rather than content. So less concerned with sort of understanding what the difference between a political advert and some other advert is, but at what we have a grip on and what we understand is that it's that transparency is the main tool. The main thing that we're looking at is making sure that people know how much money is being spent, getting a message in front of them, who is spending that money, and that some kind of assurance has been made that the person who's paying for this is actually not just fronting up for somebody else. How we approach this precisely, and whether we're using existing tools and instruments, whether it's going to come from national level, whether there is a role for the European level, is something that is still under.
Also, probably are reacting to legislative initiatives. So my question would be, what's your view on the business equation of the entire political advertising thing? Is there any future in making money in political advertising, or is it just something that's going to disappear?
Okay. So, from a business point of view, when it comes to political advertisements, we have decided that we want to continue offering it because we want to support, again, back to what I said earlier, freedom of expression, freedom of speech is really important and foundational value for the company. So when it comes to the business of political advertisement, because we get to ask that question a lot, like, it actually is a very small percentage of the total company revenue. It's less than 1%. So, and actually I think I saw statistics today saying that it was actually around 0.5% of our total annual revenue anticipated for this year, given even as a presidential election year. So for us, it's not about the revenue or the business side of things. It's really about standing by our principle that we want to offer this platform for all voices. We want to be a platform for all voices and allowing everyone to be able to utilize it equally. And then back to what Ronan had said in his presentation about the fact that if you start limiting or restricting political advertisements, you potentially will start advantaging certain political actors, the incumbents, the media favorites, and then not granting a voice then to the up-and-coming political actors, as well as a lot of the civil society groups and activists that are using the platform with very small budgets and using the platform to advance for their causes.
Okay, do we have any more questions at all for the panel at this stage? We've got one at the very back there, and after that we're going to have to swiftly move on to the second panel. So if I could ask you to introduce yourself and let us know who your question is directed for.
Yes, thank you. My name is Hilke de Jong. I'm an intern here at the Permanent Representation. Actually, I have a question for Mr. Panagopoulos on transparency. I mean, you're advocating for transparency, but aren't you afraid that that enables people to say, oh, well, instead of dealing with the message, we rather deal with the person that is sending the message or the group that is sending the message? And actually, aren't you afraid that that may rather hurt open and public debate instead of facilitating it?
Thank you. Harry?
Before you hand back the microphone, could you give me an example, just to help me respond?
Well, I think it doesn't really matter which group or country you would take, but I mean, for example, you can imagine, I mean, you self mentioned, let's say, populists, and I'm not here to defend populists at all, but I mean, it's easily to say, well, a populist group is saying this or that, so we don't have to take seriously the message that they're sending, but rather we just focus on the group and say, you know, they're the bad guys, so it's not a valid group, it's not a valid participant in the debate. If you understand what I...
Yeah, no, absolutely clear. Well, basically, that's to turn it around. That's why we want to push for transparency, not so much because we wish to privilege one group over another, but because allowing someone to know, and that whoever it is that's giving the money is you know, transparently recognizable to you. Or, for instance, that if something is finding its way into your feed, that the personal characteristics of yours that have been used in order to determine that it should appear before.
Of course, presents your first panel. I'd like to invite Shannon Baker from new.nl fact-checking platform to come up and give us her presentation. And then I would also like to invite Saskia Spieleder from the...
And actually fact-checking is only a smart part of what we do. I am the only fact-checker at new.nl, just to make clear how big we are. Subjects that I fact-check are mostly health-related and subjects that we think are of interest to the current public debates. And things we check are always factual claims. A lot of what we see of really false claims are from known satire websites or other like misunderstandings that got on Facebook, got in a different context, and are suddenly a part of the public debate, while they are completely false. And if I don't find an answer to my question at that point, I'll try to call experts, mostly scientists, because they are the most independent source I can get at the moment. So that's how I go read papers and stuff like that. That's how I try to fact check. And, well, we're here to talk about political fact-checking. I think it's sometimes hard to define where we're talking about, because you can talk about statements that are being done by politicians. That is, for example, not part of the Facebook fact-checking program. But of course also statements by other interest groups or other persons that are being a part of the public debates, so that's what I mostly do. And of course we also have like the fake news that became really big in the news during the elections in the US of Donald Trump. And to be honest, that's something we're not seeing in the Netherlands. We had one large case that was not the wages further on to make ad income. So that's like the largest example of what traditionally is being called fake news that I have seen in the past 2 years. And we have been part of the Facebook fact-checking program for almost 3 years. We have quit the program quite recently at the end of last year. And I will briefly explain what we did. We had a dashboard where posts that were being allocated by users as fake news would show up, but also Facebook had an algorithm where posts would show up there. And these were all kinds of posts. The algorithm isn't perfect yet, so most of what I saw in that dashboard wasn't even a checkable post. But I would go through that every morning to see if there was checkable stuff. And I must say, also there, most part of what I saw what was checkable is health and not exactly politics. And what we saw as politics is indeed just following the public debate that we were having at the time in the Netherlands. So if vaccinations are big, then what I did when I found out that a certain post that was being shared on Facebook was false, I wrote an article on it, which we publish at our news website, but also on Facebook I flagged that it was on social media, so we really want to check that. And as Facebook was redefining also its policies forward to the American election, we saw that we got less liberty to fact check that, and we couldn't fully stand behind the program anymore. So that was one of the reasons we stopped. What you need to understand, we were the only fact checking partner in the Netherlands, and as the only partner, we were also slightly representative of the Facebook fact-checking partner, and when you can't fully explain why you're doing it, maybe you shouldn't be doing it anymore. So that was only source calling it false, and that was sometimes hard in debate, and it's nicer to have someone else backing you up. So that's very shortly my experience as a fact-checker at nu.nl, and I'm sure many other things will come up.
Thank you very much, Shannon, for that brief introduction to your work. I'd like to turn to the panel now for some brief opening statements before getting into a bit more of a discussion, after which we'll conclude with another Q&A at the end. So if we could go to Saskia Spieleder at the end there, representing East Stratcom Force.
Thank you very much. So I don't want to embarrass you, but I think I have to fact check you because my name is not Saskia, it's Sabrina.
Sabrina, okay.
And I'm also not exactly part of the East Stratcom task force. Right. I am part of the Stratcoms division of the European External Action Service, but not part of the East Stratcom task force, which is, however, part of the division. For you. So that was an easy fact check because you can just check my passport and it will tell you that my name is Sabrina. However, overall, I think fact checking is such a complex issue. So I am not a fact checker, so kudos to you that you did it and still do it since you're a journalist in a different setting now. But still, I think it is highly complex how you approach to kind of curb I work on the EU's rapid alert system, which tries to kind of bring together member states and EU institutions to talk to each other, share best practices, coordinate. And I think that is something that we need to do, a pitch basically, that it's it's an important, fact-checking is an important part of what we need to do, but it's not the whole thing.
Thank you, Sabrina. Just to quickly jump on one of the points you made there in terms of the rapid alert system, could you just very quickly walk us through the process of how that works? And from my understanding, it's never actually been activated.
Ah, thank you. Very good.
Right.
Very good. So this is a bit tricky. It's not, well, depends on what you think is the term activated means. So the rapid alert system is a network, a community of all EU member states and the EU institutions who came together. They come together physically, but also virtually on a virtual platform to do all that, exchange information, share best practices, also make each other aware of where we see disinformation. But what is true is that there has never been an alert happened, but I think it would then, should something big happen suddenly where we need to coordinate like right away, then an alert would be issued. But that's not the whole purpose of the system.
And you mentioned threshold and parameters. Could you describe some of the elements that comprise that threshold for an alert to be made? Well,
it's still at the discretion of each member state to basically, in the end, determine when they want to issue an alert. But it would, well, some of the parameters would be that it's, you know, it is something that crosses a border, that is, because we are the External Action Service, it's an external actor doing the campaign. So this is one of the dimensions that we are looking at, so foreign manipulative interference. And
tend to hear people use a multi-pronged approach when it comes to misinformation, where of course fact-checking is a very key component to it. And it was definitely unfortunate that NU had to pull out of the program. We definitely were regretful of that, but we are working with over 55 fact-checkers around the world, covering 43 languages, and we're continuing to grow that list of fact-checkers. One of the challenges, though, when we're talking about fact-checking is that there are not a lot of fact-checkers covering every single country around the world or covering every single language. So this is why it requires us to go beyond the fact-checking solution to see what else is out there, because there's no way that you can just tackle the problem. It's not a silver bullet when it comes to fact-checking. So in terms of how we work with fact-checkers, we also go through IFCN, the International Fact-Checking Network, because we want an external source that is an expert in this area to ensure that the fact-checkers that we are working with are following certain codes of principles. So if you look at the IFCN, they have 71 signatories that have signed up to the Code of Principles. These 71 signatories are not in every single country. In the Netherlands, I think it's only NU that is the only one that is certified by the IFCN in the Netherlands. So that was one of the challenges for us for a long time, is there was only one Dutch certified fact checker. So we are looking at how to expand this with our global partners like AFP, Associated Press, all of these more organizations with global footprints, to see if we can get them to be our fact checkers in more countries. So that's of course one approach to be able to expand the work that we do there. But again, these global partners also don't have access in every country either. So spotlighting the point that we need to go beyond just fact-checking and look at media literacy programs, which is a very important part of the work that we're doing now, and partnering with a lot of different organizations around that, direct lines of communications to flag any kind of risk or suspicious activities. So this is how we're tackling the problem around misinformation, not necessarily...
Lastly, if after the split, are you working with any fact-checkers at all in Holland at the moment?
So at this moment in time, no, but we are, again, like I said, when it comes to countries where you don't have fact-checkers, we are talking to the global partners to see if we can then extend coverage there. And also, just to keep in mind as well, we're also Community Review initiative that we have, where we're also trying to bring in experts, academics, researchers that are working on certain areas to be part of a community that flags stories to us to help us better identify content for fact-checkers to look at. Because you've mentioned that there's a lot of content that's flagged by our machine learning tools, et cetera, are actually not fact-checkable. And actually I have a question on that. Like, what is your criteria for fact-checkable versus not fact-checkable?
It has to be factual. Well, like the main criterion is that it has to be a factual statement. And that's already quite hard for an algorithm to detect. And second of that, and that's why it's important to have multiple fact checkers working. Of course, you're also kind of trusting your gut feeling, like I don't fully trust this message. So that are like the two basic criteria.
Okay, thanks for that. So on that note, so I think that was, so we are expanding it, but this does not equal political speech, because I think there's a lot of confusion that this applies to all political speech. What we're talking about is strictly politician speech, and what we're defining as politicians are basically elected officials, candidates, political parties, leaders, appointed cabinet members that are appointed ministers. These are like on some sort of official recognition, right? But it doesn't mean that they have carte blanche will be removed. So it's not carte blanche, still subject to the community standards and advertising policies, because that's a baseline.
Fact-checking itself, should it be the platforms? Is it the journalists? Is it something the citizens should be involved in? Ultimately, is this something the government should regulate? Should the government get involved in fact-checking at all? I mean, personally, it sounds like a bit of a terrifying thing to me, but what's your take on it?
I also, like, as a journalist, find it hard to give any policy advice, because that's not really my role. But what I can say about what we've seen as an experience is indeed that it's important to make different distinctions in what you want to fact check and what you want to regulate, because people have been telling things that are not true for, I guess, as long as we can speak. And that's not necessarily always a problem. The harmful thing is that we have seen is if you can make money by spreading falsehoods, or that kind of thing, I think could be regulated and should be. But further than that, I don't really have an advice.
Mm-hmm. Well, along that axis, then I suppose, how can we guarantee the independence?
Best obtainable version of the truth for a long time. So I think that is important, to keep those things that we already have in place and that are in a lot of countries working very good. We should continue that, and if there is funding by Facebook or by any European organization, we should be very clear about that, and also tell that what the role of that funding is. What do we decide ourselves? We've always been very clear that we decide what sort of topics we fact check, and I think these kind of things are really key to keeping your independence, but also making it clear to the public that you're still independent.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'd like to bring in Sabrina here just to talk about the risks of not doing the type of work that Sharon...
Steps in that direction. Harry mentioned cooperation in the Elections Cooperation Network. We have the action plan, we have the rapid alert system, we have increased cooperation, we have the code of practice. So it's not like we're standing here, and tactics are evolving. So we need to can assess different parts of the effect that disinformation campaigns have, and then try to build our future responses based on that research. But also, and I know I keep repeating myself, I'm very sorry for that, but that's really a crucial point. That's why we all need to work together, because we all have different pieces of information that come together in an effective response. It cannot just be governments that do something, it cannot just be the platforms, but we really need that kind of exchange to understand the problem as it evolves and not just get stuck in 2016, but then also find effective whole of government, whole of society kind of approaches.
Mm-hmm. And in the context of European elections, I mean, whereabouts in the world are we looking at exactly? Are we focusing on, well, I assume the work you do focuses on disinformation affecting European elections coming from outside of the Union. In your research, I mean, where specifically, what countries have those disinformation campaigns emanated from?
That's a very good question. I mean, you've mentioned East Stratcom Task Force. Their mandate is very clear what actor they're looking at. However, Again, I'm so sorry. I think it's more complex than that. There's a myriad of actors out there. It's state actors, non-state actors. It's like individuals who are in there for the profit, because there's profit in there. It can be some guy, at 18 sitting at home somewhere in a basement and just pushing it out for the money of it. So it's not black and white. It's not, I cannot just point a finger, because that would be a horrible mistake in terms of our response, because we would have maybe one remedy to one tactic by one actor and ignoring all the others that are out there. And that is also something that we kind of, where we need to take a step back and look at the entire picture, how disinformation campaigns flow, how they change, what kind of actors are involved at different stages, so that we get it right, and not just by sheer, we need to do that one thing, kind of get stuck in that one alley.
Mm-hmm. Shannon, in your experience, how important is attribution in the fact-checking process in terms of identifying the source of the disinformation or misinformation itself?
Yeah, well, as I started my little talk there, it's really key to try to find where information came from. Not only because it can lead you, already can give you the answer to whether it's true or not, but because you also want to explain to the public how did this weird statement came to be, why do people believe this, how often is it shared, on which platforms is it shared. I think that's relevant information to the public, but on the other hand, I can't always find where, with 100% certainty, where I came from. Often I write in my articles, like the first time it's been seen online, or first time I could trace that it has been online, was on this platform. And for me, that are mostly Dutch language platforms, and sometimes it's, quite often it's either American and sometimes Russia Today, but like a myriad of platforms where these kind of misinformation or disinformation comes from. So, but I do think it's important to try at least to find where statements come from. But that's a hard task to do.
Meg, is there anything Facebook can do in this regard to help? Of course, we know about your ads library, but in terms of attribution and finding the source of a particular piece of disinformation, is there any?
Because it's not easy, because it requires us to go off platform, and we have a whole threat discovery team that does off platform investigations, and but even there it's really challenging when you're looking at like the gigantic ecosphere of the internet, and trying to trace it. And this is also,
that is something where I also see the platforms
by various disinformation groups.
Well, do you mean technical, or so it's just about this kind of coordinated way of doing things? That doesn't mean that it always has to be one tactic employed, but that there is, a system behind it. So it's a organized and a thought through kind of pushing out of a certain narrative that is supposed to generate an effect within a target audience. That doesn't mean it has to be like the same piece of information or disinformation that is spread out on Twitter and on Facebook, but it can be different proxies used. But that's just the thing. Me as a user, I cannot see, oh, is that kind of content also somewhere else? Did somebody else push it out? I might be able to do that if I sat down and did hours and hours of work. But that's where researchers come in and detect those networks also of inauthentic behavior, so bots or cyborgs, whatever you want to call it, that are employed to generate more spread, more reach of that, of the pieces of that campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I just want to add to that as well, because firstly I want to address the point about the actors, because we're from the European External Action Service standpoint, you guys are looking at external foreign actors. But when it comes to the kind of information operations activities that we're seeing, or things around like coordinated campaigns that are inauthentic, it's not just the foreign actors. It's also domestic actors. So this is why going back to my original point when we talked about political advertising, and we're looking at solutions and regulation and whatever else. we need to look at the full gamut of actors that are engaged. It can't just be narrowly like political parties and can't like political actors. We need to go beyond that because there's a lot of people involved now. And it's also where these coordinated campaigns, a lot of times we get questions like, is this inauthentic? Are these bots? Are these trolls? And it's actually authentic actors that are very, very passionate, I guess, about the politics and are engaged themselves in these behaviors and tactics that we traditionally thought was Russia or thought was trolls or thought were bots, but it's actually humans that are authentically engaging behind it. So it becomes more and more complicated, the problem, which is why looking at this from a reactive standpoint is one part of the formula, but we also need to look how do we prevent them from being on the platform in the first place? Which is why we're adding all of these measures around authenticity, creating points of friction in the process to slow down these actors from being able to engage, to slow down their operations, or to increase their cost of operations. So the political advertising is a very good example. We get a lot of complaints and about, especially during the European elections, because I was like in the middle of that dealing with the advertisers, where they didn't understand city and adding transparency to it as well. So when it comes to like transparency, we're also trying to include our community of users to be able to have insight into who these actors are through the page transparency tool, for example, where you can see where admins are located in terms of what they're doing on the platform. So these are all the different measures that we're trying to proactively introduce or preventive measures that we're trying to introduce to make it more challenging for the threat actors.
And how do you distinguish between inauthentic activity online and authentic activity online?
So hiding behind a fake account. So that's one of the easiest ones that I can explain.
But how do the inauthentic activity that Facebook experiences?
So when it comes to like fake accounts, so I can say this. So when it comes to fake accounts, it's not just about people like, compromised accounts, and what you're saying is basically compromised accounts. But we're also like identifying things like IP addresses where we're seeing a lot of traffic coming in, which is suspicious. So then that's how we're able to identify like bulk accounts that are potentially fake, or email or basically domain names that we're seeing like activity that is suspicious, and then we are able then to black hole that domain name overall and then block all of these fake accounts or remove all of these fake accounts in relation to that domain name. So, but how we take down for CIB, for example.
To obstruct the flow of disinformation. Did the code of practice have its intended impact? And what kind of lessons can we learn for the next round of European elections and national elections in the future? Maybe Sabrina, if we start with you.
Sure. So as Harry mentioned, the evaluation of the code of practice, also again reiterating what has already been said, already ahead of the election. So it didn't kind of just come suddenly 2 weeks before the elections, but it's more of a constant influx that is designed to, on a long-term basis, kind of shape views. So I think research is very important on these long-term effects. So because if you're constantly kind of on a low level bombarded with these disinformation, different fields into that long-term effect is needed so that we can, adapt to that. And we still need to get better at kind of communicating our own policy. So not necessarily fact-checking, but just bringing our message out there and getting it to the people that we want it to get to, and not have,
Do you advocate for more resources to be?
Oh, I would always advocate for more resources. I mean, of course. But I think it's not so much, it is of course about the money, because that is what gets you more. Yeah, well, you can fund projects with the money, but it's also about, working together, because there's so much research already being done on this topic by great researchers, great NGOs, think tanks that are like tirelessly trying to better understand this work. And so it's very important to us to have strong, to have that kind of cooperation, or those people, platforms, researchers, to pool our resources, and not just everybody does the same with their own money, but that we know what's already out there and then can identify research gaps where we can put the money that we have. So, but of course, more money would always be better.
Of course. And now just a quick minute each from Meg and Shannon before opening up the floor for questions. European elections, Meg. What were the key findings? What lessons can Europe learn for the future?
European elections, because it feels so long ago now. Because we found that there were more and more advertisements around health and crime, for example, so then we added more issues. I think the thing is, it's hard for me to say key learnings from the European elections, because from every single election we're learning new things and we're adding more and more layers to our defense measures. So I'm just trying to think key learnings. Like, I would say that one of the key learnings is that we need some sort of EU common regulatory framework when it comes to how to deal with political advertisements or campaigning across the board, as well as how to deal with elections across the board, especially when you're looking.
I haven't seen any clues that for the parliaments that were false or partly false. So I think it's important that they are aware of the example they are setting.
Okay, great. And just before we open up to the audience, Meg, I understand that your boss, Mr. Zuckerberg, is coming to town in February. Can you give us any information about who he's going to see here in Brussels? Please.
Yes. So my name is Alice Stolmeyer. I work for Defending Democracy. And earlier today I was at the European Parliament for an event on Russian interference. And one of the speakers there quoted a Foresight report stating that in 2020, so that's in only 2 years, the majority of citizens in mature economies will consume more false than true information. So it's very nice that we're focusing here on political ads and doing some fact-checking, and I don't want to underestimate your important work, but isn't this like fighting Australian wildfires with a water pistol? And it's a question for all three of you.
Okay, great. Are we fighting a losing battle? What do we think, Sabrina?
Well, I don't know. You, in terms of, there's always been propaganda, so I think it's just an ongoing thing. The question is, can we win it? I don't know, because it has always evolved. It has, different actors have been employing it in different ways with different kind of goals. So I think it's just a matter of, so first of all, very interesting study. I would like to know what they based their, what evidence they based it on, because it's actually in 2 years. But still, I think, as we cannot fight something that we don't know yet. So research is evolving, and then we can adjust what we're doing. So I think while we're always going to have this issue of false information, whatever you want to call it, out there, because that's just what has always happened, I think it's a matter of changing and always trying to keep up and curbing what we know right now, so that it's not, just there and we're just saying, yeah, well, you decide for yourself, we don't care. That cannot be the end state, in my view.
Okay, Meg?
I think I'm just going to reiterate what I said originally, is that this is a whole of society problem, so it requires a whole of society solution. So it's not, and right now a lot of it is focused on like the big digital platforms, for example, as it should. But at the same time, there are a lot of other players that are also operating in the digital sphere that we have no access to. We don't know what's going on there. That also needs to be brought into the fold. So basically, going back to my point, that we need all the different actors that are engaged: government, civil society, academic researchers, fact checkers, Facebook, platforms, journalists, etc. Everyone to be involved in some way, and including citizens as well. And this is why media education is important as well. So everyone has a role to play in tackling this problem.
Shannon?
Yeah, I completely agree with with what you guys said. It's not just fact checking, but what I think is important part of fact checking is indeed also educating people about how they can evaluate information, but can be used in a broader light.
Now, how do you think that could work in practice in terms of educating people how to identify what a fact is and what isn't a fact? Would anyone else like to?
Well, I can say that we've seen some programs that have made some interesting impacts. Like so, media education or digital literacy is definitely very, very important. Long-term view. But in addition to that, I think it's very much about again, engaging in all the different actors and trying to basically as a whole come up with solution as opposed to trying to individually, industry coming up with their own solution, government coming up with a separate solution, fact checkers.
Those are all working on fundamental rights online. My question is in response to Meg's comment about preventative measures for inauthentic or threat users signing up to platforms, but I would welcome comments from any of the panelists. So I agree in principle with the idea of making it harder for inauthentic actors to join platforms, but I'm wondering what measures are being taken to protect people that rely on anonymity online, so whether that's whistleblowers or human rights defenders. How are we ensuring that their privacy and their freedom of expression and their actual safety as human beings is being protected with these measures increasing? Thank you.
Yeah, so that is one of the, like we talked about, transparency versus community standards around bullying and harassment. We also do engage with a lot of these actors directly. So we work with, for example, certain media publishers on how to protect their journalists. We work with different organizations like Reporters Without Freedom, or Reporters Without...
It's sadly true. It's getting that way at the moment.
Yeah, I was thinking, but so we do work with a lot of these different organizations to see how we can help them in terms of, from a safety and security standpoint, how we can help them in first educating them on how to protect themselves on the platform, because there's a lot of different controls and tools on the platform that users aren't even aware of in terms of how to keep themselves safe. So so a lot of education is invested into that. But secondly, also looking at the kind of risk in each market for these actors, and then what kind of solutions we need to deploy.
Okay, great. Let's move on to another question, please. This gentleman here, thank you.
Hi, Trevor Davis, Institute for Data Democracy and Politics from George Washington University. Oh boy, hi Facebook again. Nice to see you. I'm going to direct my question in this direction. Is Facebook a platform or a publisher? It seems completely self-evident that they are a publisher because they're making decisions about what people see, and they're doing so solely on the basis of what will keep people engaged, clicking, and having ads rendered to them, because the users are a commodity. And you look no further than their SEC filings to know that to be the case. So this is all well and good, but the physics of Facebook are antithetical to outcomes I think are compatible with democracy. So my question to you is Facebook prepared to take active steps to ensure that people can't do things like, say, with your new groups feature, post to 50 different groups at once without people being aware of what the source is? Is Facebook even moving remotely in the direction of recognizing that it's not just an inauthenticity, it's not just the person who shouted fire, it's the stampede, it's the trampling, it's the harm?
Okay, great. Meg?
Controls for people to customize their newsfeed for them and know how to use them. With regards to the question around, sorry, what was the second question again? Around
the active steps.
The active steps that we're taking. We have done a lot around additional, so going back to my point, so back to what we're trying, back to all these measures, a lot of it is around transparency and a lot of it is about providing users with additional controls.
Okay. We have one more question. Let's have one from the back there from someone who hasn't asked a question yet. This lady sitting at the back, and then we're going to have to wrap up rather swiftly.
Hi, my name is Nadia. I work for Avas. It's an NGO that is working on or against disinformation. especially around elections. My question goes back to what you said regarding the fact-checking of politicians' speeches. I can read directly from the policy. Stance of that claim has been debunked elsewhere. So basically, let's say if a candidate shares a video saying that the sky is red, then it will be demoted because this video was done by someone else. But if he shares a video of him saying that the sky is red, then this content won't be debunked. I would like to understand why that would happen, and because in my opinion, this only makes this information more powerful, because it's like, okay, why Nadia, why when Nadia posted that was taken down or that was demoted in the timeline, but why when Trump says that, it's kept online? Obviously because Trump knows better than the other Facebook users. So yeah, that would be my question. I would like to understand the rationale that took Facebook to that decision. Thank you very much.
Okay. Meg, you're a busy one tonight for you.
So I think this goes back to what I had stated earlier, where we believe that, especially when it comes to politician speech or around elections or the democratic process, we err on the side of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, especially when it comes to politician speech, because it's one of the most highly scrutinized speech where you have journalists looking at it, especially like in the EU. The journalists are looking at it, fact checkers are looking at it. So we don't think that we should interfere in that democratic process. And it's a way also basically allowing these politicians to be held accountable, because if we remove it, then nobody knows that they've said that. Or if we demote it, we're basically artificially inserting ourselves into the democratic process and the political discourse.
And I can almost smell the fumes coming over now. I'd just like to say thank you very much for our panellists for taking part this afternoon. It's been a very lively and engaging conversation, and I hope you'll stick around for a glass of wine, and thanks very much for coming along. Thank you. Great.